All right. Well, ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished scholars of non-binary gender, welcome to the latest and greatest meeting. Well, maybe not greatest meeting, it remains to be seen, of the Guerrilla Philosophy Club here at California State University, Sacramento. Stingers up. I am Dangerous Daniel Schultes. I am the club's treasurer, which is a very, very meaningless title, if we're being honest here. And we are here privileged to hear from Kyle Swan, philosopher, and he's going to be talking about, it looks like, the problem of state authority here. And so I will turn the time over to him.
Yeah, so I'm gonna try to provide a defense of philosophical anarchy. So that sounds like it's like a really extreme, way out there kind of position, anarchy. But it might sort of fall flat, because I think in the end, it's going to be a really intuitive and not really very controversial point of view. It has to do, the defense of anarchy is going to be presented by way of presenting a problem of political authority. This is the problem of accounting for the authority that states present themselves as having. So that's just by way of introduction. Let me give a definition first of political authority. First, consider this notion of practical authority. Someone's a practical authority over another person, just by definition, or if and only if the ones demand that the other do something, makes it the case that the other has a reason to do it. So in this case, I'm a practical authority with respect to my daughter, Lucy, because if I tell her to do something, this creates in her a reason for action, a reason that she might not have even had before. And the reason is supposed to be relatively strong, like it should function pretty prominently in her deliberations about what to do. It's almost a kind of obligation to FI when a practical authority tells another person to do something. Now, all political authority is just the idea that states operate in something like that way with respect to its citizens. They have this special normative power to create pretty strong obligations in their citizens. Okay. Now, just to be clear, the kind of reason that they're supposed to be creating isn't merely pragmatic, like they'll hurt you if you don't do it. It's not just providing an explanation about why the person subject to the other does it because of some kind of threat or whatever. The sort of reason that they mean to be creating is genuinely normative. It's the command or the directive that actually justifies the reasons that the other has to do the thing that they're told to do. So it's not just about, it's a normative power, not just some kind of brute kind of power. It's not just because they're bigger or stronger or they have a bunch more guns. It's because they have this kind of sort of moral magic to create obligations kind of out of thin air, just by issuing a directive to their citizens to do something. So of course, I have these slides to present, and some of them are important, some of them aren't that important. But I do want to make it clear that you should stop me or just pipe up if you have any question about anything that I present or anything that you want to ask me about before I go on. You can do that anytime. You can even interrupt me. I won't mind. So
if you're shy, you can type it in the chat, or just don't want your voice on recording. You can type it in the chat, and I'll interrupt on your behalf because I'm not shy.
Okay. I don't see anything in the chat right now. So, but is this at least clear enough to go on? Do you have any questions about this? Right. Okay. Then I will go on. So the problem of political authority is just accounting for this this supposed normative power that states claim for themselves. Like, do they have this? Can they just, by issuing a directive, by making a law, by passing one, create in their citizens these fairly strong obligations or reasons for doing things, even reasons that they might not have had before? So that it's sort of created by the directive. It's not just that the state is a reliable directional signal about what reasons the citizens have prior to the directive. No, it's that the state is making it the case that their citizens have this reason for action. And it could be true that they didn't have it before at all. So they're creating an obligation where one might not have existed. Okay, so can they do this? Does the fact that the state requires SPY generate at least a prima facie obligation for its citizens to FI? I'll stop here to make sure. Does anyone have a question about what I mean by a prima facie obligation? I'm not going to tell you if you don't ask. Okay, you must know that. So, I mean, one kind of way to start worrying about whether they actually have this is to just wonder, well, what if I is something bad, right? What if what you're told to do, what if something that's passed as a law conflicts with like some ordinary moral obligation that pre-exists any of the state's directives? Like, if you think that there are just obligations that people have, pre-existing moral duties, there's at least the potential for there to be a conflict between what the state directs a citizen to do and one of these obligations. I bet we could think of an example of times where it's been true that the state has attempted to create an obligation to do something that went clean against some of their pre-existing moral obligations. I think you could think of one. Am I right about that?
I feel like to some extent you could probably guess like there's at least some sort of population in every government that would probably react to their laws in that fashion. Like, no matter, like, basically there's probably going to be a minority or a majority, like at least some small group in various place, which is going to perceive it in such a fashion, is my prediction at least.
Well, what would be one?
What would be one?
And I actually think I'm going to make a stronger claim. I bet we could think of one where it's not just a matter of perception by some minority group who feels oppressed because of disagreement, but just clear cases where the state has directed its citizens to do things that are morally wrong. But I'll be happy to start with any kind of example in this neighborhood where there might be a problem.
I don't know if I'm just like brain dead or just sort of like not terribly bright, or I suppose we'll find out. Like, I can think of like many instances where the state has permitted something that is absolutely not permissible, and like where laws about that. I mean, slave,
Yeah.
but like that didn't occur sort of like it slaves. So that's kind of where I'm hung up.
Yeah. Now I think that's at least close, right? So what you might not know this, but there were cases where slaves would run away from the South, flee to the North, and people in the South who at the time owned these slaves got really grumpy about that. And so eventually they got the federal government to pass a law that required Northern citizens, people in these destination states, to cooperate in the capture and return of runaway slaves. This was called the Fugitive Slave Act. And so you could actually be arrested, penalized, if you helped a runaway slave evade capture and return. But you could also be punished if you did nothing about it and could have.
Yeah, I did know that already. I do not know why that didn't occur to mind. But there we go. We managed to flesh it out. Someone smarter than me can talk now.
So that's one kind of example where the state directs people to do something, and it seems to run clean against their moral duties, their pre-existing moral duties. But there are a range of cases where the state claims for itself to have the moral right to do something that it would be wrong for a non-state agent to do. And so this might be another case where we might worry about there being a violation of a moral duty, not because it's commanded on the part of citizens by the state, but that it's the state doing it, right? So, I mean, one way, I'd put this as a question, but I could even put it in form of a different question. Why should we think that the state has the moral right to do something that would be wrong, and like clearly and obviously wrong, for any non-state agent to do? Right? So here's another definition. I'm going to call the view statism, the view that says states have the moral right to do things that it would be wrong for any non-state agent to do. Alternatively, what I think implies this is that statists think that political authority is a thing, that states actually have this normative power to create obligations in other people, obligations even that they didn't have before. Statists think that states have practical authority. So that's one view about this kind of stuff. What I'm construing as anarchism is just going to be the denial of statism. So we can distinguish between different kinds of anarchism. The kind that you might be most familiar with was the kind that Johnny Rotten sang about for the Sex Pistols, where he said, or sang, or yelled, "I don't know what I want, but I know how to get it. I want to destroy the passerby." That's not the sort of anarchy that I'm talking about. There's another view called political anarchism. This is roughly the view that, like, we shouldn't have states. Like the political entities that we see, like in Washington, D.C. and other places around the world. These are bad, and we should get rid of them. I'm not even talking about this view. Most anarchists aren't Johnny Rotten anarchists. Many more anarchists are political anarchists. But today, this evening, I'm only defending philosophical anarchism. States don't have practical authority. Political authority just isn't a thing. And the same moral standards apply to state and non-state agents alike. You don't get to shrug off your moral obligations just because you're an agent of the state or just because the state's told you to do something.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
And I suspect I might maybe know the answer to this question, or sort of I'll get into it, like sort of my question is that in terms of what tangibly ought to be done, isn't philosophical anarchism yield the same result as political anarchism? And if you sort of get there eventually in your slides, or address that, we can go ahead and table that. But that's sort of my immediate concern about the distinction, is that, like, practically they're the same.
Yeah, I don't think that that's right. I can't remember if I talk about this coming up, so I'll just say right now that it's possible. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that neither political anarchism nor philosophical anarchism mean no rules. What they mean is, in the one, political anarchism means no state, and philosophical anarchism means no state authority. So it could be that in an anarchic society, I imagine there will be lots and lots of justified rules that it's permissible to enforce. It's just that you don't need state agents of the state to enforce them. They'd be enforced in a decentralized way rather than a centralized way. They would be, they wouldn't be enforced by a state, but there would still be rules. Also, in a society that had a state, it's possible that there's a state and it's the one enforcing rules, but the only rules that it enforces are compatible with all of our pre-existing moral duties. And so it doesn't take itself to have political authority. It doesn't take itself to manifest it anyway. It doesn't issue the reason to obey the rules of this state would be because those are good rules to have, not the fact that the state passed it or enforces it. Do you see the difference? So I could say as a philosophical anarchist, here's the state that I see around me. Do I have to obey it? And the answer is, it really depends on what rule we're talking about. Many of the rules that it enforces are really terrible. And as a philosophical anarchist, I wouldn't take myself to have any reason at all. I would say it's false that I have any reason at all to obey those rules. The fact that it's a state telling me to do it means nothing normatively. But there are other rules that actual states enforce that get the good housekeeping seal of approval in terms of things that are legitimate to enforce. It's permissible for the state to enforce those rules because basically it would be permissible for anyone to enforce those rules, right? And so I would have a reason to obey those rules that the state is enforcing, but not because it's the state enforcing it, or not because it's the state that's telling me to do it. Do you see the difference?
I mean, like, theoretically, I see the difference, but I don't know that in the tangible world, like, I'm having the difficulty is coming in sort of wrapping my mind or trying to envision a notion of how philosophical anarchism does not ultimately result in political anarchism. I think it's not sort of the ultimate consequence, because like I guess it would sort of depend on what we mean by state, but like, to me, like, I don't know, at the very least, like, a state has to have, if not a monopoly, at least, pretty strong on at least sort of like a reinforcing of the rules, which does mean that there's something that like a state can do that other people can't, because
not in principle, though. Not in principle. It's not if in principle, and if I see you hurting someone, it would be legitimate for me, not an agent of the state, to enforce the no hurting other people rule, to stop you from doing that.
Are you saying like the goodwill, basically? Is that a smaller term for it?
No, all I'm saying is that, like, if there are rules that are justified, independently of whether or not any state exists, independently of whether or not any state is enforcing that rule. But sure, if the state has the rule, that by itself doesn't mean that I don't have the authority to enforce an otherwise legitimate rule. People do it all the time, enforce moral rules.
I guess maybe
we don't do it in the same way,
yeah,
but we definitely do it.
Yeah, I guess maybe I mean a little more sort of doling out punishment, but in truth, I think where I'm getting a little hung up on is that, like, I'm just trying to envision the notion of a state without political authority, and I don't like that. Feels oxymoronic, and that's why I can't separate like philosophical anarchism from political anarchism in practice. It's like I don't know what a state without political authority looks like. I don't know what a state without some sort of special powers that ordinary people don't have looks like.
Yeah, what it would look like is that it would not be, it would depend on what it's doing, right? So if it's not imposing and enforcing rules that run contrary to our pre-existing moral obligations, and permissions, then it wouldn't be taking itself to have the authority to create obligations where none existed before. But that's just the thing, that's just the way that I defined what political authority is. So if it's the only thing it was this sort of agency that we designate with the authority to enforce rules. Which rules? The ones that are the good ones, the ones that are all compatible with morality. So they wouldn't be taking themselves to have the authority to do things that non-state agents can't do. They would be doing them, and they would be designated as the sort of salient enforcer of these good rules. But there's nothing about their status, their normative status, that entitles them to that position. It's almost like it's just a convenience for us that we have some third party that does the work that we need doing.
Okay, that's making a little more sense. Skylar, you had your hand up. Do you want to jump back in here?
I was trying to think of a way to explain it. I don't know. When it comes to the statism structure, I suppose, what was described, I like to think of it in terms of functionality, in terms of like the congregation of people. Like there's going to be that functional consequence of how people interact with each other, and now it's just going to be applied to a larger group in a more streamlined, accessible manner. Like if we supposedly have those ideals set in place without the presumed authority of a political law or whatnot, then I suppose under that framework, I was trying to find a way to smoothly integrate this, but for someone to believe outside of, well, because it doesn't exist anymore, that normative statism authority doesn't exist anymore in this circumstance, but for that person who we would have otherwise presumed to be in that moral of goodwill, and I'm going to do the right thing, I'm not going to be fed into what the state would have otherwise had wanted me to do, which was bad, to instead stick to my own goodwill, but my own goodwill is to kill people who I think don't represent that goodwill.
Oh.
So, and subsequently, that person, that entity will continue on that path. I say, who doesn't represent my goodwill, because I don't care who it is. I'm thinking in terms of the archetype itself. You have that formation of justice, you're subsequently going to feel justified in continuing forward and then actually create statism in and of itself from that framework, if you have enough power, if you have enough people who are going to feel similarly, because regardless of the lack of statism, there's going to be that social, at least like that social interpersonal hierarchy of truth to some degree in place between people, which can like breed paranoia and so forth. So there's like that inevitability, so to speak.
This strikes me as an easy case. If there's like a person out there who thinks that it's awesome to go around killing people, then I imagine it's legitimate to stop that person from doing that. It's legitimate and justified to stop, for anyone to stop that person to do it, whether they're an agent of the state or not. The fact that you love to go around killing people doesn't mean that there isn't a justified rule that allows us to stop you. And
maybe, yeah, sorry.
So I think that this is an easy case because it's one that the state enforces, and it's also one that it's legitimate for the state to enforce. But it's not legitimate for the state to enforce it because it's the state enforcing it. It's legitimate for the state to enforce it because it's one of the rules that would be legitimate for anyone to enforce.
Okay, then let's build upon this scenario a bit. In this case, we're thinking that someone who's, at least in our mind, is going around and killing people because they want to, that we have the authority to stop them because it's a legitimate reason. Let's say there's a group of people who see that as unjustified because the person in question, obviously, or I guess not obviously, because there's a plethora of premises that come to you even thinking that in the first place, that such a movement to stop this person is disregarding all of their context and is just going to breed then a precedent of whoever is out there causing violence. We're not going to listen to what they're doing and so forth. So we've really just repeated the same.
Yeah, I don't
so to
see,
speak.
I really don't see that. All you're saying is that sometimes there are people that don't agree with the rule. And I agree with you that sometimes people don't agree with the rule. And now there's two questions, like what kind of disagreement are we talking about here? There are disagreements in interpreting and applying the rule, which can be very difficult. And then there are disagreements about whether or not the rule in some more abstract form is legitimate. I'm not giving you an account of what makes something a justified rule. I assume that there is one. All I'm doing in defending philosophical anarchism is saying, here's an account of what it means for a rule to be justified that is false. And that's the statist account. The statist account says that if the state says to do it, it's legitimate to enforce. and I'm saying that that is not a good account of what people have reason to do, right? I have some examples coming up where there is a lot of a disagreement, and you can see how I'll deal with that disagreement. And you might want to interject there and ask the question again.
But speaking of interjection, Amir, you had your hand up, and I know you got something to say.
I was just gonna kind of add to that. Wait, can you guys hear me? I don't.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Or not add to it, but inquire more into it. So would the idea be like checks and balances would be between the individuals in the community themselves?
You're asking how an anarchic society would actually function?
Right, yeah. I guess that would be more so.
Since I'm not defending political anarchism, I don't really have to do that in this talk. In another talk, I would be happy to do that. But since I'm only defending philosophical anarchism, all I have to do is show that states don't have political authority. Right? So maybe
I see what you're saying. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's a bit clearer picture, perhaps, of the view of what it is. One implication of it is that there's no duty to obey the law simply because it's the law. Another implication of the view is that states aren't morally special. They don't have some magical normative power to create obligations where obligations didn't exist before. Another implication, so they can't create obligations out of thin air. Another implication is that if it's wrong for a non-state agent to do something, then it would also be wrong for state agents of the state to do it. Another implication is that states and agents of the state should be held to the same moral standard that any other non-state agent is. All of these things are just another way of saying that states don't have political authority. Of course, as I was saying before, no political authority doesn't mean no rules. And so we're ruling out Johnny Rotten anarchism. Likewise, no state doesn't, wait, let's see. Yeah, no, not having a state doesn't mean no rules either, because anarchic societies that existed in the past definitely had rules, enforceable ones. But all of this is assuming that we have pre-existing moral duties to follow certain rules. And these are the ones that's legitimate to enforce, legitimate for anyone to enforce, whether you have a state or not.
All right, we got some hands here. Okay,
So before I take these questions, one question you should be thinking about is whether you can counterexample this or something like that. Are there examples of states creating genuine moral obligations, but these were something like out of thin air, created by the directive, by the imposition, by the passing of the law? That's the thing that made it the obligation. That would be if you can come up with an example like that, that would be a problem for this view. So I don't know who was first.
all right, we got Tralaja on there. Once again, did not pronounce that correctly, but I will get it eventually. And then we have Skylar, and then I'm going to take a turn unless someone else raises their hand.
You got that right, though. Well, I just wanted to ask if federal agents are also included in
Yeah,
this,
that's why when I use the word state, I don't mean like the 50 states. I mean,
Okay.
like the apparatus.
Okay.
And yeah, it would be essentially the entity that sort of passes, enforces, and interprets the law.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Skylar, go ahead.
I think I probably conflated the political anarchism, philosophical anarchism. So the reminder of that later on helped. I feel like what is like being repeated comically reminds me of the lines of thought that I very frequently repeated, not to say that I don't currently now, as it's a recurring, I still believe it. Like in terms of how I perceive parenting, for example, like if we kind of take states or state agent and then we take parent, I'm like, wait a second, I've been a philosophical anarchism since as far as I can remember.
Yeah. I mean, I actually think that's like a nice example. In fact, I used it on one of the earlier slides as an example of actual practical authority. I used the example of me and my daughter. Now, this doesn't work so well anymore because my daughter's 17. And so whatever authority that I at one point had with respect to her is just hanging on by a very thin thread. But when she was very young, my directives functioned as reasons for her. I could create obligations for her to act, even ones that are kind of purely arbitrary. For example, I had a rule in the house that said, don't eat the sweets before you eat your regular meal. Wait until after your regular meal before you eat your sweets. Now it's not like part of the nature of things that has to be the way it goes. I could perfectly well imagine a household where they did it differently, even the opposite way. But in my house, we did it this way. And that's what she had reason to do. Now, I actually think that there's a big difference between thinking that it's okay for a parent to have some measure of authority over his daughter, and thinking that a state has some measure of authority over a normal adult person. But I think that this has mainly to do with the fact that when I had this kind of authority over my daughter, she wasn't a normal adult person. She was just a little kid, and they aren't really fully functioning agents yet. And so it's hard to interfere with the agency of someone that doesn't have agency. Normal adults are different. Normal adults are full-blooded moral agents. And to think that someone can just go around telling them what to do is morally problematic for the reasons that that political authority is morally problematic. Now, there are ways that I could have exercised my authority incorrectly. There are limits to the authority that I had over my daughter. Not every dictate that I issued probably was compatible with or pre-existing, were ones that she had reason to obey. Not all the time. I wasn't perfect. And my authority only extends so far. But I think I had it, at least to some degree. I don't think states really have it at all.
All right. Well, I will attempt to give a little pushback here. But first, I will say, you mentioned your grip, holding on by sort of a thread. It's been my experience that, like, even if your grip was still really, really strong on that authority, teenagers don't listen anyway. I mean, like, I certainly didn't listen as a teenager, and neither did anyone else. So it winds up being somewhat of a moot point regardless. But like, one of the things you said on there is that some of its implications are that if it's wrong for a non-state agent to do it, then it's wrong for the state to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's maybe a little bit where I was having some issue, where I was giving kind of pushback to you, because it's like
Is it like this new
like,
slide?
Hmm?
Is it like this new slide?
I mean, like, I think yeah, like that, like I have something in mind like this. Like what's popping into my mind is that, like, I don't know, like I think we would generally think that it would be wrong for, I don't know, like, let's say someone let's say someone stole from my store and I saw them do it and I got them on videotape and everything. We probably think that it's appropriate for some state agent to, you know, arrest them, book them, and then whatever we think of the bail system, let's even get rid of the bail system and, like, arrange for whatever, you know, necessary, like, you're going to show up for trial kind of arrangement stuff. But we wouldn't, I don't know that we would think that it would be appropriate for me to go about and doing that. And so, like, if one of the implications is that if it's wrong for non-state agents to do it, it's wrong for the state to do it, I don't know, I'm kind of questioning.
There's a kind of like a implicit qualifier here, which I didn't include, but it would be something like, in principle, right? There's nothing special about states that sort of magically give them the authority to do these things. In principle, we could do it a different way, where if it's a legitimate rule, then, like, anybody could enforce it. We do it in some cases. In other cases, just as a matter of convenience or pragmatics, yeah, we designate agents of the state to do it. I mean, we have them. We can't get rid of them. They do serve certain kinds of functions, at least well enough, and they're doing this. So the fact that they're enforcing legitimate law isn't something that necessarily should get a philosophical anarchist up in arms about. What the philosophical anarchist is worried about and objects to is them imposing and enforcing rules that we don't have some other independent reason to go along with. So that I think that way of answering takes care of like at least a range of possible examples, counter example, like problem objections.
Yeah,
It's
I'm
sort of
still-
like in principle, yeah, I think it would be, because I mean, for example, if we didn't have states, we would still have rules and we'd still need some way of enforcing them. Maybe it would be done in a purely decentralized way. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe we would designate certain agents who had the relevant sort of expertise to go about doing this. And in a sense, it's a practical thing that doesn't really matter philosophically, how we did it. What matters is the rules, not who's doing it.
All right, I think we got Justin, we got Shalaja again.
So to answer the question that's on the slide right now, I would say that every instance of the state killing in vengeance would classify in this. So the death penalty would count. And in addition to that, I would say that like drone strikes on other countries in retaliation for terrorist acts on our country, we would not think that a non-state agent was capable or allowed to do such things. But for some reason, we do think that the state is allowed to do those things.
The way to do this, the way to see that if your counterexample works, is to imagine a society that didn't have a state. And then they were attacked by outsiders, and whether or not they could retaliate with drone strikes. I think if the answer is yes, then that wouldn't count as an example where the state doing it is legitimate, but non-state agents is illegitimate, not in principle.
Would you think that the death penalty would be then?
The same kind of test, right? I could imagine a society that didn't have a state that had a rule that called for the death penalty for its violation. If that's possible or a plausible kind of state of affairs, if there's no inconsistency between no state, still okay to enforce some death penalty in certain cases, then I don't think that would count as an example of what I have in mind here. Because in principle, there isn't anything special about the state doing it that makes it okay. It's whatever it is that calls for a state in our world to do those things that makes it okay. Right, the principle of justice or whatever. So another way of putting this is that if you have a state and it's following the relevant principles of justice, right, then they're not claiming for itself this special normative status to create obligations out of thin air. They're respecting and acknowledging this principle of justice, and they're acting in conformity with it. Now now the question becomes what this principle of justice actually looks like, what the justified moral and political rules are. I haven't given an account of that, so I'm leaving that as a kind of empty box. You fill in your own account of that, and I'm saying once you have that account, there's nothing special about a state doing the imposing or the enforcing of those rules.
Shalaja. and then Skylar.
So I just kind of wanted to ask if abortion laws would be, laws that are kind of pulled out of thin air on no good reason, but the state is obligated to follow them. It is
Yeah.
considered.
Again, I'm not defending an account of what the legitimate rules are. I'll just say, you tell me what the account is, and then I can tell you whether or not the state can do it. And I would tell you that for all of those, it's not really important that a state be the one that does it.
Okay.
Right. So, I mean, what makes like abortion law really difficult, I guess, is that people disagree in really basic ways about the legitimacy of the rule, one way or the other. But I don't have an account that I can just sort of pull out of my back pocket and tell you about. So this is more about not what the correct account of justice or what the correct account of legitimacy is. It's not account of what the appropriate justificatory standard is. I'm just saying that once you have that, I think it's easier to see why if states can't do anything to run contrary to it. So here's an example.
All right. Maybe before you get to the example, Skylar,
there's one more.
yeah,
one more hand?
do you have something more you want to follow up on?
I mean, if depends on the example, because I was going to try to be a bit long, frankly.
Oh no.
Maybe better to go first. If you want to go first.
Well, let me finish the presentation because I have some test cases, and then maybe they'll raise some of the questions you had, and maybe you'll think of like you'll think of a shorter way to make your point in the meantime. So here's an example of Sam and Kyle. And in this example, Sam thinks that the book Kyle is working on is really good and wants to support the work by giving him money to buy out a year of his teaching load so he can finish it. And then it would be like you'd have this really good book. Sam really likes this idea. So what Sam does is he demands $1.40 from every person in town to raise this money. If they refuse, then Sam locks them in his basement. Quick question. Is Sam's behavior morally acceptable?
Depends on how good that book is. If you're working on a killer book here, then I'm at least willing to entertain offers. If you're, I don't know, if your book is just I don't know, hypothetically a long argument about how the best Metallica album came out in 1983, then yeah, maybe Sam's out of place here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the problem is that whether or not it's worth doing is something that's subject to reasonable disagreement. I don't know. I'm not going to be able to convince everybody. Those we're not able to convince refuse, and Sam locks them in his basement. Is Sam's behavior morally acceptable? Not a trick question. This just ordinary moral thinking delivers the conclusion here that Sam is doing something wrong. I don't think that's controversial. But look, think about the NEH and Kyle. The NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, thinks that the book that Kyle's working on is going to be really good and wants to support the work by giving him money to buy out a year of his teaching load. The NEH uses proceeds from taxes. On average, the NEH gets about $1.40 per household every year to fund academic projects. If you refuse to pay, eventually you're going to be locked up. Is the government's behavior here morally acceptable? So the question is like, what's the difference between Sam and the NEH that makes what Sam does clearly morally illegitimate, but apparently morally acceptable for the NEH to do the same thing. Here's another example. This is a case of Sam and Lisa. Lisa lives in the land of not enough food, where there's not enough food. Lisa walks 50 miles so she can make a life-improving trade at the market in the town where Sam lives. Sam forcibly prevents her. He stands like blockade against Lisa's entry, using coercion to stop her from going to the town. He's worried that Lisa's trading activity will lead to adverse effects on his family and friends, like economic effects. Maybe Lisa will take somebody's job. He also worries that Lisa will introduce aspects of her culture where he lives that he doesn't like. So because of Sam, Lisa has to return to not enough food. And there she suffers from malnutrition and illness. I think Sam's behavior here is not morally acceptable. I think what we should say about this is that Sam has caused Lisa's malnutrition and illness. I wonder if anyone disagrees with that.
This example I got no disagreement on, and I know where the ultimate analogy is going here, and I don't know that I got much disagreement there. The previous one I have things maybe to say, but not this one. But just to add real quick, William did say about the example of like putting people in the basement. He just wanted to add that that has to be a very large basement, and he is right. It would have to be quite the sizable basement.
Yeah. So here's the parallel case. The USCIS does the exact same thing that Sam did, except they do it to thousands of Lisas who want to migrate to the US where they can make a lot of life-improving trades. Their department does this to protect citizen workers from labor competition and to do what they take to be protecting American culture, whatever that is. As a result, many of these people denied entry, or the ones that are deported, suffer from malnutrition and illness. Before I said that Sam's behavior towards Lisa caused her malnutrition and illness. I'm inclined to say the same thing here. And if it's different, then the burden of justification is on the statist to say why this thing that would be clearly and obviously and non-controversially illegitimate if Sam did it, suddenly becomes magically okay if an agent of the state does it. So I'm not sure what the statist can say.
Again, on this one, as something of a statist myself, this one I got nothing for. The taxation one, I at least have I mean, it's a somewhat obvious response, but at least a response worthy of consideration. But this one, I got absolutely nothing.
I mean, one way to do this is to identify some kind of disanalogy between Sam and the US government, such that these disanalogies show that, yeah, it's definitely not okay that Sam does it. But because of these disanalogies, the different moral considerations apply, and it's totally awesome when the US government does it. But again, the burden for suggesting these disanalogies is on those who think that they exist.
Go for it, Justin.
Again, I can't speak to this case, just like Daniel can't, because I certainly don't have any issues with the immigration side that you're trying, or the immigration point that you're trying to prove here. But in the first case, it does feel like there is a social contract issue at play. The government has, we haven't endowed the government with the ability to collect taxes to pay for the social programs that we all vote on.
I'm not talking about, so I'm not talking about all social programs. I just gave an example of the funding.
Right, totally. Right,
So,
totally. But it comes out of the taxes that.
No, that's fine, right? But I would at least want to say that taxes that go to some places justified, taxes that go other places not justified. So I purposely picked an example of one where this is a benefit to a lazy academic who enjoys a pretty decent middle-class lifestyle and not like hungry or homeless or without adequate medical care.
Kyle, do you have something you want to tell us?
I'm saying that things are okay for the old Kylester.
Okay.
And that you shouldn't feel bad if you completely slash the National Endowment for Humanities, even if I was up for a grant. And that's because I don't think there's just no justification for a program that taxes the lower middle class and gives to like the very comfortable. And that's what these taxes do.
I want to push back. I think maybe on a similar sort of note as Justin.
One more point though about the other thing that Justin said though, introduced a claim about some kind of social contract, which if it works, I have a hard time seeing how it doesn't work in the other case. So if there's really a social contract and it really operates the way that social contract theorists say that it operates, then that would be sufficient to establish that states have political authority. It would be the contract that gives them the authority to impose and create obligations for its citizens. Now, since I don't think that states have political authority, I reject the idea of a social contract that would do this work. And what I would say, because if you can show one, you could say something like, well, what justifies the state's political authority, what legitimizes it, what says it's okay for them to impose these obligations that they just sort of make up for whatever reasons they think they're good. It's the fact that you agreed, there's a contract. But I would say, no, I didn't. And so I reject the idea of a social contract because there isn't one. So that's actually something we can, where is it? Yeah, I have this on a slide.
Yeah, and I knew it was coming, but I sort of wanted to like make I think it's a short point. By the way, once again, Justin's cat has graced us with their presence. This is delightful. But back to the sort of example of the National Endowment of the Humanities and everything, and like, well, they collect that they receive this sort of tax. In order for that to work, we have I mean, like, taxation is literally being made analogous to theft. We have to say taxation is theft, and that's that's a little rough for me, given everything
Not
else
saying
going
that.
on in there. And
I'm not saying taxation full stop. Taxation per se is theft. What I'm saying is theft is unjustified taxation. And I would say that taxation that funds the NEH is that.
what has me a little bit hesitant with that is I don't know, because that's basically like taxes are collected the same way regardless of what we use them for.
So what I would be
And-
saying is unjustified is having or funding an NEH.
Like I'm just like still I still think that like I'm not seeing enough of a terribly compelling reason here, because like
Oh, I haven't
like-
given one.
no,
I
like
haven't given
not for not funding the NIH, but for like drawing a sort of distinction. Like functionally, what you have to say is like is something close to like no, like sometimes taxation is this sort of like basically you have to say like no, sometimes there are some things worth jailing and coercing people over, and then other times there's
Definitely, I definitely say that. Definitely, there are some things worth arresting and jailing people over.
No,
Or punishing them in some other way.
I mean, in terms of like funding, like sort of arresting people for not paying their taxes in order to fund. And
What it would have to be true is that those tax proceeds would be spent on a program that enjoys the relevant justification. I'm not saying that none do. If some do, again, imagine an anarchical society where because of some kind of collective action problem or because of some kind of need that isn't met because of some kind of collective action problem, they regard themselves as having justification for collecting some funds to go towards that end. And it's true, by whatever the right account of justice is, or the right account of justification is, that this is a legitimate rule to impose. I'm not ruling out that that's possible. I am ruling out that doing so somebody can finish a book project. I'm saying that's not legitimate.
I think I see. But we got Shalajay.
So I was gonna ask, basically, you might think that funding the NEH might be an illegitimate
Yeah. That's why I used it as an example, because I
yeah,
think
but then on the other hand, there might be some people who might think that being taxed for say public schools and stuff like that when they don't have children is illegitimate. So
I'm very sympathetic with that idea, but I'm not. Maybe invite me back and I can talk about why. I'm not going to do that now. I will talk a little bit about this one, about why I think it in particular doesn't seem like a plausible candidate for a rule that enjoys justification. I know that it's controversial. I know that people disagree, but one reason to think that I'm right about this is because of this case. It's clearly morally unacceptable for Sam to do this to people. Just so what? So I can finish a book project? I'm entitled to somebody's money? Some people who are like less well off than me? That doesn't seem particularly plausible. I mean, in general, I would be against any kind of social program where you have a transfer of wealth or income from bottom to upper. And that's what this does. There are other examples, but not every example of taxation is like that. That's because taxes fund things that aren't always like that. So we could talk about, I don't know whether we want to talk about some of these possible disanalogies. This is the social contract one. This is where I just deny that there is a social contract. Right.
I
So,
guess just sort of as a, I mean, I'm fairly certain I know kind of roughly where you would go with it, but as a matter of getting it on for the recording for the benefit of future generations, you know, suppose I sort of like I make the argument like, oh, I mean, you say you didn't sign, but you sure seem to be like reaping a lot of the benefits of all of the different things, you know, you got the implicitness on there, like does that, you know, you don't seem to complain when the fire department comes down there, and you know that was done through the state and through non-wholly, or at least not wholly voluntary taxation or things of that nature. And so what say you, philosophical anarchists, to this?
Yep. So here I'm not speaking qua philosophical anarchist, but sort of qua social contract theory skeptic. And so, yeah, I'm skeptical about a social contract theory where you don't have a contract. Agreements are awesome when you have them because they can empower someone to have authority over another person. Whenever that's part of the agreement, okay? And social contracts theorists tend to say that that's what happened with the state. And so they say, I say, no, there's no actual contract. They say, I don't care, because you enjoy certain benefits. And when you enjoy certain benefits, then even if you don't explicitly agree, you implicitly agree. And it's an implicit agreement is like where the terms are understood by both parties, where I don't agree by saying I agree, but I agree by certain things I do. The problem with implicit contracts is that you can very easily cancel the implication that you agree. You can do that by saying, I don't agree. You can do that with any implicit contract. It gets trumped by explicit dissent.
Yeah, like I said, that was just attempted to be kind of a lukewarm defense there. I ain't gonna go that my hill to die on will be more illustrious than the social contract, but just for completeness' sake.
Yeah, so the slogan would be something like explicit dissent trumps implicit consent. Now, other social contract theorists don't really rely on implicit consent. Most of them don't. Most of them rely on hypothetical consent. Hypothetical consent isn't real consent, though, because it's hypothetical. It's like not been offered in any way or other. So the way hypothetical consent is supposed to work is that I know you don't consent, but you would consent if you were thinking about this better. If you were smarter, if you were like thinking about this rationally, if you were like a good and rational person, then you would agree. I know you don't, But since you would, if you were good and rational, we can treat you as if you did consent, whether you consent or whether you dissent. And basically the argument is the state is offering such a good deal that you would be crazy to turn down the terms on offer. If you were good and rational, you would consent. But I mean, generally agreements, genuine agreements, ones that are permissible to enforce don't work that way. I mean, there are two prongs of this attack. Actually, I think reasonable and good people can reject a state. I don't think that there's any inconsistency with being good and rational and saying, not for me. Right? But the second thing is, even if I'm wrong about that, I don't think being wrong gives anybody an entitlement to enforce an agreement that I don't think is good for me. Like, I used this example before. If my car is worth $20,000 and you offer me $40,000 for my car, I don't have to take it just because it's such an awesome deal. If you came in night and broke into my garage and took my car but left $40,000, I think I'd still have a legitimate complaint against you.
Yeah. Something I see pretty regularly on on the internet from I don't know, like you know those people who like say they're libertarian but they're just like they're functionally anarchist, or like that sort of realm of thinking is. And there's a fairly common talking point. It's like try applying the idea of hypothetical consent to sexual relations and see how that makes you feel and see how that works out for you. Like, we don't need to be that explicit or triggering, I don't think, just out of sensitivity to everyone. You don't know who's listening to that sort of thing, but like if you run that through in your head, it looks real nasty.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm not sure why it would work in the case of states. It doesn't work in any other area where people interact with each other. I'm not sure why it should here. There's a kind of argument based on democratic authority, right? So governments are voted into office. Sam wasn't. That would be a disanalogy between the US government and Sam. I don't think this works, because would it be okay for Sam to compel $1.40 from everyone in town if 51% of them voted to endorse my book project?
But we're not a popular vote democracy. So we're not a popular vote democracy. So what if the electoral college went around
then
town
whatever rules,
I'm
whatever voting rules you think establish democratic authority.
Yeah, sorry, I was just being a smartass. It's all good.
That's fine. That's fine.
Florida and Ohio have decided that your book project is perfectly legitimate, so that's just what we're gonna do now.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I just don't think that you change the moral status of an action just by getting a lot of people to agree with you. So I don't think in general democratic authority works to establish political authority. So I reach a conclusion, I guess, then. There's no moral double standard. Philosophical anarchism is true.
Well, shit, I'll clap.
Okay, thanks. Now, there are some interesting things to say about political anarchism, which is that you can actually look in history at stateless societies and see how they did things. You can look at various aspects of ways we do things here and now without a state, where a state isn't involved in stuff, and wonder why about the things that the state does, why we need it to do them. And so if you do enough of this, I actually think that it can be plausible to say that we don't really need one. And so I'm actually not just a philosophical anarchist. I think that political anarchism is cool too.
I am shocked, agog, and flabbergasted at this revelation.
So why stop short of Johnny Rotten then?
Because just because I think there are like real rules that enjoy justification that you can legitimately enforce. I don't think the fact that we don't have a state, if we don't have a state, means that I'm okay with like people running around hurting each other, right? What's going on there is you're not identifying the authority of some entity, not a person, let alone a state. When you're enforcing a rule, you're identifying something like the authority of morality. And I think morality has genuine authority over our actions. Morality is the thing, not political entities. Morality is the thing that makes it true that we have these relatively strong reasons to do things. Morality creates obligations.
So let me ask you a question then. Since morality seems incredibly subjective in actuality, how it plays out. Yeah, I mean, how do you have?
I don't think you believe that. You were defending the other week. I saw you were defending virtue theory. I know that you don't believe that. I mean, I think that the supposed subjectivity of morality doesn't do what I don't think it implies, to the extent that it's true. I think it's true that to some extent moral rules don't have to be the same everywhere and always. I agree with that. But I don't think that's enough to undermine the entire moral project. It doesn't undermine the idea that we can have legitimate enforceable rules.
To sort of jump real quick here back to
sorry, Justin, what it would mean if it's true that morality is to some extent subjective, is that which moral rules are justified to enforce can be different at different times in different places. But there's still a morality that's legitimate to enforce.
But like, just to sort of like kind of help me wrap my head a little more around it, I guess I'll phrase the question this way. In a sort of stateless society, you said that it's like theoretically totally on the table to like collect a taxation to collect a fund of sorts, for use of collective projects. Like, would you say that there are instances where, like, let's say, 5% of the people don't want to contribute whatever the generally agreed upon percentage is that they should contribute or whatever? I mean, would you say there are instances where it is morally acceptable to say, too bad, we're gonna take it anyway?
I mean, I would say that about any legitimate rule, right? If the fact that somebody doesn't like it and doesn't want to go along with it, you say to them, too bad, we're going to require this of you.
I guess what I'm asking is more directly you personally, like, do you believe that there are projects like important enough that even if people do not want to voluntarily, like in the stateless society, do not want to voluntarily give up a percentage of their income, it is nonetheless enforceable to coerce in some way or make it obligatory even against their explicitly, like all things being equal, will? Are there things important enough that it is still nonetheless justifiable to tax?
So like, do I think that independent of whatever, like independent of the state's presumed authority, independent of that, do I think that certain social welfare programs are justified? Yeah, of course.
And more specific, like, do you think making people contribute a portion of their income regardless
that's
of
what
their
I meant.
explicitly
Yeah, that's what I
stated?
meant.
Okay. Okay.
The idea that these programs would be justified means that it would be justified to require of people whatever is necessary to enact them. Now, there's all kinds of qualifications that I'd be interested in like introducing to that. Like, I mean, it's like a contingent thing, like it's contingent upon, you know, it being a genuine need. I think that the what you're required to provide is going to be sort of limited. But if you're just asking whether in principle, certain kinds of positive welfare provisions enjoy justification independently of the state, yeah, I think so.
Okay, because in truth, that I think is where a lot of people's opposition to anarchy kind of comes from, is like a totally like I have no interest personally in a purely totally 100% like voluntary pooling of resources, because I just don't trust people enough to.
Yeah, I mean, if you look in history at how stateless societies functioned, they weren't like that. They had requirements. Some of them required of its members that they do things that they didn't want to do. Some of them.
Can you point to one?
Like the most like a lot of historical work has been done on the way saga period Icelandic society functioned. They didn't have a state, right? There are certain roles that governments now tend to occupy and do, where you had societies that had a state, but they did very little and almost none of the things that we typically associate with states doing. Like, for example, in societies that had states, sometimes they had a very largely private legal system, and not just enforcement like by police, but also judges, trial lawyers. The whole legal system was in effect privatized. And so there's this idea that, oh no, if we don't have a state, then all of these really important functions will just go out the window. But there's just so many data points in history where we can point to them doing those things, figuring out how to provide these really important social services. It just wasn't provided by a state.
I think I'm still maybe a little bit confused then about what exactly constitutes a state. And I think maybe even my disagreement with everything might come down to like I don't know, like, so I guess with the, like what constitutes a state? Because I think my definition of state might be more specific than the definition that's used or that you're using here.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't have a problem with thinking of it as like I think this is the Weberian definition that you were suggesting earlier. that it's the entity that has a monopoly on force in a given, usually geographic domain, and I think that encompasses enough of what I was thinking of as political authority. When it has that monopoly power on state, then it takes itself to also have the power to create obligations to act on the part of its citizens. So I think that's fine for a definition of a state.
Okay. Well, I feel like I've been talking a lot, and strictly speaking, these meetings are officially listed to be an hour long. They never are. They always
oh my goodness, it's 9 o'clock. Holy cow.
They always run over. Contingent, of course, on Professor Swan having, time to answer more questions. Does anyone else have more questions they want to ask or more things they want to say, particularly for the recording?
Thanks, y'all.
Yeah, going once, going twice. Okay, well, I guess I'll prepare to end the recording now. Thank you to Professor Kyle Swan, Associate Professor of Philosophy here at California State University, Sacramento Stingers Up, and Director for the Center of Practical and Professional Ethics, and known metalhead, all around good guy, for coming and speaking to us. Next week we have our final meeting of the semester. Unless he has forgotten, Mike Paletti is going to be talking, I believe, about color, and that should be really interesting. Hope you can join us for that. And with that, this is I have been and will continue to be the treasurer of the